Jeff Ratcliffe. I'm Steve Palazzolo. Today, introducing Jeff, our fantasy expert, because this is what you guys need to know about our entire fantasy channel over at PFF and all the beautiful knowledge that Jeff will drop on you. Because, look, if you're playing fantasy, all you need is the PFF data. That's what I use, Jeff. I just roll into my drafts, don't even do any research, just check my lists and all the rankings that you put together, and I win every single league.
There you go. You win every single time. I don't know if we're going to get that. We're not promising every single time, but yeah, the information is great. There's no doubt about it.
It never, ever fails, right? So it's all part of your PFF Edge and Elite package, and I want to get into the three biggest fantasy storylines. I know you're looking at all of the big stories, but what are the three biggest ones that you're looking at heading into the 2018 season?
And you're right, and there's so many we could possibly talk about, but right now, Le'Veon Bell, the top of everybody's list for fantasy purposes. It's either him or Todd Gurley. And we saw last year the contract situation, ended up playing under the franchise tag. And there was a narrative out there that he wasn't quite himself over the first 2 weeks of the season. Now, I think that most players aren't. The way that the preseason is structured now, we don't really see them hitting their stride until we get into mid-September, if not even October for some of these guys. But it looks like the same thing is going to play out. There was some information out there. Adam Schefter had said something about, well, maybe he sits out games. I don't see that happening, and it really doesn't change much for me in terms of where I'm ranking him. But, you know, concerns about that. What do you think about Le'Veon Bell with this situation?
So the biggest thing about Bell from a regular football / fantasy standpoint is just his versatility, right? The fact that he is so prevalent in the pass game, and for the Steelers to maximize that offense, I know they have scored a lot of points without him and everything, and putting the ball in the quarterback's hands isn't the worst thing in the world when you don't have the running back. Big Ben can certainly carry them, but they are much more difficult to defend when Bell can line up wide as a wide receiver and really tap into that skill set. So when you're talking about fantasy value for a running back, how important is the volume aspect of it? I mean, is that really the big part that separated Bell?
The volume, but it's not just the volume. I mean, he went over 400 touches last year, which is a monstrous number. I love to see running backs at 300 touches. I mean, if you're talking 20 touches per game, that's 320 touches. So in and around that range, you're going to score fantasy points. But the differentiator, as you mentioned, is his ability as a receiver. Led the league among running backs and catches, and the value of a catch is significantly higher for fantasy purposes, especially if you're in a PPR league, than the value of a carry, just because you're adding in those points. They average more yards per reception. So all of that with Bell, it really takes it over the top.
And it matches up with all of the work that our analytics team is doing. Running backs, you got to catch the ball to live up to that true value. Give me another big storyline you're looking at heading into the season.
Well, we've been so spoiled in this era in terms of quarterbacks. You think of the greats. Manning now is out of the mix, but for fantasy purposes, Peyton was so good. Drew Brees, so good over these years. Tom Brady, Aaron Rodgers, Big Ben even. But it's time for the young guys to step up. And we look at some of these young guys in this year's crop of quarterbacks who have the potential to break out, and there's some exciting names. Patrick Mahomes really tops the list for me. We saw Deshaun Watson really break out last year, and I've been asked, well, who could that guy be this year? Who could just set the fantasy world on fire? I think it could be Mahomes. If I had to place my chips on one guy, it might be him taking over there with those weapons in Kansas City. But there's also Jimmy Garoppolo. We know that Kyle Shanahan's offense has been favorable for quarterbacks in the past. We saw Matt Ryan, what he was able to do in 2016. So Garoppolo doesn't quite have the weapons, though, that Mahomes has for fantasy purposes. So that's why I'm giving the edge to Mahomes. But if I had a dark horse, a little bit of a long shot to break out, it's Mitchell Trubisky in Chicago. I'm excited about Matt Nagy's offense, which has obviously similarities with what we see in Kansas City, with what we see in Philadelphia, and bringing in Allen Robinson, Anthony Miller, who I like a lot in this year's draft class. They have weapons out of the backfield, and I think Trubisky is going to be more comfortable in that offense.
Yeah, I mean, starting with Trubisky and all of those playmakers, clearly the purpose of the offseason for the Bears was surround him with talent, and I like the different style talent that you mentioned. Robinson's ability to go down the field. Anthony Miller can win from the slot, win from the outside. Taylor Gabriel can pick up yards after the catch. Trey Burton can become the mismatch guy. And then you look at what they did in Kansas City last year, just schematically, just a few extra shovel passes here and there added to the mix, just free yards and all of the screen yards that Kansas City had. I think Trubisky absolutely benefits. And then Mahomes, I know from a fantasy perspective, quarterbacks like that who are a little bit more volatile, might throw a few more interceptions, but they're going to take chances. who cares about the interceptions at that point, right? And I think Mahomes, a guy when he was in college, #2 in the entire NCAA in big-time throws, those big, special, highly graded PFF throws, but also #2 in turnover-worthy throws. You know he's going to take chances down the field with Tyreek Hill, with Sammy Watkins, with Kelsey in the middle of the field. So he is poised to have that good season because of his playmakers. And then Garoppolo, he just elevated that terrible roster last year. He'll find a way to win. Jimmy G's been incredible since he's been on the field.
Yeah, he has. He has every time he's gotten the opportunity. And that's what I love to see. When these guys have the opportunity, they step up. And for us, for fantasy, they score fantasy points. And you mentioned interceptions. I mean, hey, there are gunslingers out there throughout the history of fantasy football. Brett Favre comes to mind. I mean, he was a great fantasy asset. In an era before we really saw this passing explosion in the NFL, he was putting up big-time fantasy points. Now, I'm not saying Mahomes is the next Brett Favre or anything, but he could be the next big thing for fantasy purposes.
A lot of people have called him the next Brett Favre, so at the very least, he's going to be extremely exciting. Give me a third thing, biggest storyline heading into 2018.
You know, there's some disappointed fantasy owners out there of Julio Jones from last year. Only scored the 2 touchdowns, but let's come back to reality just a little bit. The guy has 4 straight 1,400-yard or 14-plus 100-yard seasons, which is extremely difficult to do. And, of course, we have a metric here at PFF, yards per route run, where he's not only been elite, I mean, he's set numbers that over the last 3 years are almost unapproachable compared to what we've seen in recent history. It's so impressive, so remarkably efficient on a per route basis. And the thing is, in fantasy, we often overvalue touchdowns just because they are worth 6 points. That's significantly more than 1 yard, obviously. So what do we do here? Well, touchdowns, they regress to the mean, ultimately. And the thing that I like about Julio Jones most last year is you look back to how frequently he was used in the red zone. That was the big complaint. They don't use him in the red zone. Well, they did this year. 16 end zone targets, which when you average 1 end zone target per game, that's a big number. So I like Julio Jones for a big bounce back, and I want to see those touchdown numbers go up. I think they do.
Yeah, and especially when you look at what he was doing in 2016, there were plays where he's taking the 20-yard dig and taking it 75 yards to the house, and we were saying, whoa, Matt Ryan's stats are getting padded by Julio. Those things go in bunches, and Matt Ryan has had seasons where Julio's padded his stats, has padded Matt Ryan's stats, and then other years where maybe it's worked the other way. So that yards per route run metric, I don't always like looking at our stats, in isolation. That's probably our best stat as far as pure production. The best stat we have at PFF. That's a non-fantasy stat. So it just shows how good Julio is because he wins all over the field. So there you have it. It's Jeff Ratcliffe, our fantasy expert over here at PFF. Be sure to check out the entire PFF Fantasy channel. Go subscribe over there and subscribe right here to the traditional Pro Football Focus channel.